Cincinnati, I need you to sit down for this one, because there is a player on this Bengals roster who most of the fan base has already mentally filed away as an afterthought, a backup, a guy who's about to lose his job to a flashier name, and I am here today to tell you that if this team loses sight of what he actually brings to the table, they are going to regret it in a way that could cost them games in 2026. What's up, everybody? Dre here from Street Hoops, and today we are talking about a guy who does not get talked about nearly enough. A guy buried in the middle of one of the deepest defensive line rooms this franchise has built in years, and a guy who I genuinely believe might be the single most important depth piece on the entire Cincinnati Bengals roster heading into this season. I'm talking about TJ Slaton. Yes, the nose tackle. Yes, the guy a lot of you probably assume is now just a rotational body now that the Bengals have gone out and invested serious resources into their defensive tackle room. Well, buckle up, because after going back through an entire season of tape, I don't think rotational body even comes close to describing what this man actually does on a football field. And I think there's a version of this season where TJ Slaton quietly ends up being one of the most impactful players on this entire defense. Let's get into it. First, let's set the stage, because context is everything with a story like this. The Cincinnati Bengals spent an enormous amount of this offseason building out their defensive line, and specifically their defensive tackle depth, and I mean genuinely stacking that room. We're talking about a group now that includes proven veterans, ascending young talent, and a level of overall depth at that position that this franchise honestly has not had in a very, very long time. When your defensive coordinator can rotate fresh, powerful bodies into the trenches on nearly every series, that changes the entire math of a defense. Offensive lines get tired. Offensive lines wear down over the course of a game and a season, and when you have wave after wave of legitimate NFL-caliber defensive tackles to throw at them, that's when you start to see a defense transform from average to genuinely scary. That's the story of this Bengals defensive front in 2026. But here's the twist that I don't think enough people are talking about. In a room this deep, in a room with this many names getting hyped up, it becomes very easy for one specific player to get lost in the shuffle, to get labeled as expendable, as replaceable, as the guy who's going to see his role shrink now that the front office brought in reinforcements. And that player, according to a lot of the chatter I'm seeing from fans and even some analysts, is TJ Slaton. And I think that is a massive, massive mistake. Let's talk about who TJ Slaton actually is for a second, because a nose tackle is one of the most thankless, least appreciated positions in all of professional football. You are not getting highlight reel sacks most weeks. You are not getting your name called on national broadcasts. You are, more often than not, doing the dirty work directly in the middle of the defensive line, eating up double teams, clogging gaps, and making the plays around you possible without ever showing up prominently in a box score. It is a position that lives and dies by whether the guy playing it has real, functional power and the football IQ to understand leverage, hand placement, and gap discipline at an elite level. And when I went back through this Bengals defense, specifically looking at how it improved over the course of last season, one name kept jumping off the tape over and over again in a way that genuinely surprised me. TJ Slaton. Let's start right at the beginning of last season, because the very first defensive snap of the entire year, Slaton is lined up at nose tackle, shaded into the A-gap, and what happens next tells you almost everything you need to know about who this player is. Off the snap, Slaton is explosive. He is quick out of his stance in a way that a lot of people simply do not expect from a player his size at that position. He gets his hands inside on the Browns' left guard, a genuinely excellent veteran offensive lineman, and he does not just hold his ground, he drives that guard backward, hands still inside, head still square, completely collapsing the pocket of space the running back needed to work with. The linebacker behind him is forced to step up immediately. The running back has nowhere to cut back to, and even though the officials could have thrown a flag on the offensive line for how far Slaton was driving his man backward, the whole sequence ends up as a modest gain instead of the explosive play the offense was hoping for. That's the first snap of the entire season for this defense, and it's Slaton setting the tone. And it does not stop there. The very next defensive snap, Slaton is flipped to the other side of the formation, this time working against the right guard, and you watch him get underneath his opponent's pads immediately, hands driving back inside in what almost looks like a hand-fighting sequence straight out of martial arts, and he sends that offensive lineman retreating in real time, creating instant pressure on the quarterback. 2 snaps into the entire season, and Slaton has already shown you explosive power against 2 different blockers on 2 different sides of the formation. Then, later in that same game, on a 3rd and short situation where the offense clearly believed they had a favorable matchup to pick up the first down on the ground, Slaton gets doubled by 2 blockers simultaneously, and instead of getting washed out of the play the way a lot of nose tackles would in that exact situation, he takes on the double team, sheds it, reads the running back's intentions perfectly as the play is designed to flow one direction and then get cut back against the grain, and finishes the play by running clean through his final blocker to make the stop right at the line of scrimmage on 3rd down. That is not a fluke. That is not a guy getting lucky. That is a veteran defensive tackle understanding leverage, gap discipline, and hand technique at an extremely high level, all within the first handful of snaps of an entire season. Now let's fast forward to the middle of that same season, because there's a play I have to show you that I think is genuinely one of the most impressive individual reps by any Bengals defender all year long. Goal line situation. Slaton is lined up directly over the center, and instead of winning with pure power the way he did earlier in the season, he wins with an absolutely filthy swim move, getting the center to lunge forward and fall completely off balance, staying on his own feet the entire time, and running down the ball carrier to make the tackle. That's not just power, that's finesse. That's a player who has multiple ways to win a rep, who isn't just a one-trick bull rush only nose tackle. He can overpower you in the run game with straight strength. He can shed a double team with hand technique and vision, and he can beat you clean with a legitimate finesse pass rush move when the situation calls for it. That kind of versatility at the nose tackle position is genuinely rare, and it's exactly why I think comparing him purely to a player like Dexter Lawrence, who is obviously one of the premier nose tackles in the entire league, actually undersells what Slaton brings. He may not have the same explosive first-step quickness as some of the very best in the league, but according to people who track leverage and hand-fighting technique closely, Slaton plays with better leverage than a lot of nose tackles at times, and that's a skill that shows up again and again on tape. And here's the part of the story that I think a lot of casual fans completely missed, because it happened again just a couple of weeks later against a different opponent, in what is essentially a near-mirror image of that exact goal line situation. Same alignment, same responsibility, and Slaton wins the rep in almost the exact same fashion. That's not a highlight. That's a pattern. That's a player who has built a legitimate, repeatable skill set that shows up on tape consistently, not just in flashes here and there. Let's talk about the Chicago matchup, because this might be my favorite sequence of tape in this entire breakdown. Slaton lines up at nose tackle against one of the better guards in the entire league, a genuine future Hall of Fame candidate at the position. And instead of getting overwhelmed the way you might expect a rotational nose tackle to get overwhelmed against elite competition, Slaton locks him out completely, controls him with his hands extended, keeps his eyes working inside to read the play, and when the running back tries to cut the run back against the grain exactly the way the offense drew it up, Slaton discards his blocker entirely, stays in his gap, and helps finish off the tackle for a minimal gain. Against one of the premier guards in modern football. That's not a small accomplishment. That's a legitimate veteran-level rep against genuinely elite competition, and it happened multiple times over the course of that same game, including one particular sequence where Slaton reads a zone run perfectly, stuns his blocker, gets his eyes into the backfield, and essentially takes away the cutback lane before it even develops, forcing the running back into a phone booth of defenders where the play has no chance of success. There's also a rep from that same stretch, where Slaton simply lifts an offensive lineman clean off his feet in the run game, sending him into a full panic, before running him directly into a teammate to finish off the play. And then, to cap it all off, there's a legitimate sack, Slaton working an outside hook move against the center, getting him fully turned and opened up with no ability to re-anchor, disengaging cleanly, and finishing the play by bringing down the quarterback himself. Now here's where I have to be completely honest with you all, because part of doing this the right way is showing you both sides of the tape, the good and the areas that still need work. And with TJ Slaton, the concern that keeps coming up when you dig into the numbers and the tape together is not really about talent at all. It's about consistency and workload. Slaton played a genuinely enormous number of snaps last season, one of the highest snap totals of his entire career, and if you go back through the tape closely, there are stretches, particularly as the season wore on, where the explosiveness that shows up so clearly in these highlight sequences seems to dip. Now, I want to be very careful here, because I am not in that building. I am not in those meeting rooms, and I don't want to sit here and question a man's effort without real evidence. What the tape actually suggests, and what a lot of people around this defense have started to point to as well, is that fatigue is a far more likely explanation than any lack of effort. Playing that many total snaps at a position as physically brutal as nose tackle, snap after snap, game after game, is simply going to wear a player down over the course of a full season, and that wear shows up as a dip in explosiveness even when the underlying talent and technique haven't gone anywhere. And that right there is exactly why the story of TJ Slaton in 2026 is so fascinating to me. Because as the Bengals built out that defensive tackle room this offseason, the natural shift that occurred organically over the second half of last season already started pointing toward the exact solution to this fatigue problem. Slaton's overall snap share at the true nose tackle spot began to shrink as the year went on, with more of those reps going to other players in that room, and in turn, Slaton started seeing more time kicked out to different alignments along the defensive line. And here's the kicker. According to PFF's grading data, his pass rushing numbers actually improved during that exact stretch, consistently grading out in the high 60s to 70s range for pass rush production once he wasn't strictly being asked to anchor the nose every single snap. That is about as clean a real-world experiment as you could ask for. Take a genuinely powerful, technically sound defensive tackle, reduce his workload at the single most physically demanding alignment on the line, rotate him into different spots, and watch his production actually climb. That's not a coincidence. That's a blueprint. So here's my actual argument, the real thesis of this entire video, and I want you to really sit with this. I don't believe TJ Slaton should be thought of as a fringe rotational piece who's about to lose his job now that the Bengals have added talent around him. I believe TJ Slaton is the single player on this defensive line who benefits the most from that added depth, and in turn, becomes one of the most dangerous weapons this unit has. Think about what a full defensive tackle rotation actually does for a player like Slaton. Instead of grinding through 500-plus snaps a season at the most physically punishing spot on the field, he can now be deployed strategically, fresh legs on rundowns where his power and leverage completely dominate, kicked out to different alignments on passing situations where his newly improved pass rush numbers can actually shine, rotated off the field entirely during the stretches of a game where fatigue would otherwise start eating into his explosiveness. That is not a diminished role. That is an optimized role, and when a player this talented gets deployed in an optimized role instead of an overworked one, that is exactly when you start to see career year type production. There's also a broader team building point buried in all of this that I think Bengals fans need to fully appreciate, because it's easy to get excited about star power and forget how much of a genuinely great defense actually gets built through exactly this kind of quiet depth. Picture this front-rotating, fresh, powerful bodies at defensive tackle essentially every single series of a football game. You can move your top nose tackle around so he's not just lining up over the center on every single snap, which protects him and keeps him fresher for the moments that matter most. You can mix and match your rotational pieces based on the exact matchup you're trying to exploit that week. And when you have a player like Slaton who has shown, on multiple documented occasions on tape, that he can win with power, that he can win by shedding double teams with vision and technique, and that he can win with a legitimate finesse move when the situation calls for it, that is exactly the kind of chess piece a smart defensive coordinator wants available in as many different situations as possible. According to people who track defensive line rotations around the league closely, very few teams have the kind of depth at defensive tackle that would allow them to deploy a player of Slaton's caliber purely as a rotational weapon rather than an every down necessity, and that is precisely the luxury this Bengals defense has built for itself heading into 2026. Let's talk about what this actually means for the defense as a whole, because I don't think we can discuss TJ Slaton's role in a vacuum without talking about how it changes everything else up front. When you have legitimate, functional depth at defensive tackle, every other player in that room benefits. Your top nose tackle doesn't have to play an absurd, league-leading snap count every single week, which protects him for the long haul of a season and for the postseason when it matters most. Your top pass rushers on the edge get to operate behind a front that isn't wearing down in the fourth quarter of games, because fresh legs are constantly rotating through the interior, and the overall unpredictability of who's lined up where on any given snap makes life significantly harder for opposing offensive coordinators trying to game plan around this defense. That is the kind of structural advantage that shows up not just in one flashy highlight, but across an entire season of close games, fourth quarter defensive stands, and the ability to survive the attrition that a full 17-game schedule inevitably brings. So here's where I land on all of this, and here's my genuine no-filter prediction heading into 2026. I do not think TJ Slaton is a player who is about to lose his job to newer additions in that defensive tackle room. I think TJ Slaton is about to have arguably the most efficient, most impactful season of his entire career, precisely because that added depth is going to let him operate in exactly the role that maximizes what he does best, instead of the exhausting, every down workload that limited him at times last season. I think there's a real path where by the time we get deep into this season, TJ Slaton is a name that Bengals fans are talking about not as a forgotten depth piece, but as one of the quiet, unsung reasons this defense is playing at a legitimately elite level. Is that a guarantee? Of course not. Health and role distribution and week-to-week matchups will all play a factor, and nothing in this league is ever set in stone. But based on everything we just broke down together, the tape, the improved efficiency numbers once his workload started shifting, and the structural advantage of a genuinely deep defensive tackle room around him, I would be shocked if TJ Slaton is not a significantly more valuable piece of this defense than most of the outside football world currently gives him credit for. And that right there is exactly why this story matters, Cincinnati, because championship-level defenses are almost never built on star power alone. They are built on exactly this kind of depth, exactly this kind of quiet, unheralded player who does the dirty work in the trenches that never shows up prominently in a box score, but shows up constantly in the results. TJ Slaton is not a name that's going to trend on social media most weeks. He is not going to headline highlight packages the way some of the flashier names on this roster will. But if this defense is going to take the leap that so many people are now projecting for it in 2026, I genuinely believe he is going to be one of the most important reasons why, precisely because he's the guy quietly making everyone around him better in a role that's finally been built to let him thrive. If you got something out of this breakdown, do me a favor and smash that like button. It genuinely helps this channel grow more than you'd think. Drop a comment and let me know your take. Is TJ Slaton criminally underrated heading into this season, or am I overselling a rotational piece here? I want to hear it. And if you haven't already subscribed to Dre Talk Sports, get on that right now, because we're bringing you no-filter football and basketball news, breaking stories, insider reports, and deep dive film breakdowns just like this one all season long. Turn on those notifications too so you never miss the next upload. I'll see you in the next one.